Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on influence in government, public opinion, and polling. Now, when looking at how public opinion is measured, the answer to that question is polling. Polls are how we measure public opinion. Now, prior to the 1930s, there really wasn't any polling. So the way we understand public opinion today from, say, the American Revolution or the Civil War is measured by studying things like newspapers and political speeches and voting returns and travelers' diaries. When looking at those things, newspapers for one, we can see letters to the editor, we can see editorials by the editorial staff, and kind of see and gauge what public opinion said, say, in 1862 or 1875. We can look at political speeches. Not to be too negative, but we all know that politicians do tend to pander to political opinion. And so with political speeches, you can look at political speeches and gauge where public opinion is by what the politicians are saying in their re-election campaigns and just in general speeches as a whole. We look at voting returns. Now, a lot of people would say, well, what does voting returns have to do with it? Well, people usually vote or tend to vote based on what their opinion is of some kind of public policy. And then finally, traveler diaries. Many times you'll see people from foreign countries writing their diaries about American politics and public opinion. You may see Americans write about that if they're visiting a different state with different public opinions on different things. So all these items prior to the 1930s is kind of how we came up with public opinion for things like how many people supported the Union during the Civil War, or how many people supported American Revolution and independence versus who supported the legitimate government, the United Kingdom, versus those who just didn't care either way. And remember, that's also a major indicator, is who just doesn't care. Now, when we look at public opinion, you would think that public opinion would be very important for the United States as a quote-unquote democracy. But public opinion was never really even a focus for the Founding Fathers. And there's two reasons for this. First of all, when you look at the Founding Fathers, they felt that public opinion was built into the government anyway, and they felt that that was through the House of Representatives. Members of the House of Representatives at the time of the Constitution being written were the only people who were elected directly by the American people. The Senate was, of course, appointed by the state legislatures. The president was appointed by the Electoral College. The judiciary was appointed by the executive branch. So really, the only place that the population had a say in things was the House of Representatives. And because of that, taxation and spending, that's why the House is the sole authority to start things like tax increases or spending, because at least the government had some say in that. But representatives as a whole, whether it be in the House or in the Senate, are not beholden to public opinion. And that's kind of why we have multiple year terms. In the House of Representatives, you have 2 years, and in the Senate, you have 6. And it's because the Founding Fathers wanted them to have some consideration into what public opinion was, but they didn't want them to have too much. And that's because the Founding Fathers truly feared what we called the masses. The Founding Fathers did not believe that the average American had the intelligence and or the understanding of things as complex as governing, taxation, government spending, that they really should be making too many decisions about that. That it was more for the elite class to make that decision. And this kind of goes against, at the beginning of the course, I asked what the United States was, a majoritarian or a plurality. This really goes against the idea of a majoritarian government. Now, to refresh your memory, a majoritarian government is a government where the majority rules. Whatever the majority of the people want, the government should do. Well, that does work sometimes in America, but we do have a very strong plurality streak in our government. And plurality is essentially free expression of a minority opinion, and that the government should respect that. So in the US, there's a really fine balance between the majority of what the majority of people want versus what the minority opinion is and protecting their rights. Now, when you look at the distribution of polling, and we're going to talk a little bit about polling in this lecture this week. I'm going to look at one poll specifically. We're going to go over it about 5 or 6 slides to explain it. But I want you guys to understand, first of all, when we talk about distributions of slides, what is a distribution? Well, it's how the poll shakes out. Some polls have what's called a skewed distribution. Some polls have a bimodal or bimodal, depending on how you pronounce it, distribution. There's no wrong or right way. I've heard it both ways over my career. And the third is what we call a normal distribution. Now, what are these? Well, first of all, let's look at the chart. And the chart, part A, it talks about the position of people on the death penalty. 67% of people favor it. 5% say they don't know. And 28% of people say they oppose it. Okay. Well, when you look at that, that is a skewed distribution. Now you might say, well, why? Well, because when you look at the shape of it, it is what we would consider to be a bell shape. But you see that one of the more frequent responses is on the side versus in the middle. And that's partially because of the don't know in the middle. Okay. Normally, a true bell curve would be where the peak goes would be the highest amount of people. So say 28 and 5 were on the ends and 67 was in the middle. That would be a more bell curve. But this is a generally speaking bell curve distribution because its mode is still enough to create that bell curve. Now remember, look at it's all depending on the percentage of respondents, okay? And if you look at how this is, I mean, you'll have 100% of responses. It's always going to be based out of 100. And that's one thing to always know about polls is they're always based out of 100. Now, they may not equal 100. 67 and 28 does not equal 100, okay? There's always a group that doesn't answer, or there's always a group that creates the margin of error. Now, if you look at the second model, this is what we call a bimodal or bimodal distribution. If you look at it, 38% of people, when you look at position on healthcare and whether the healthcare law will improve quality of care, 38% of people say it will improve. 45% will say it worsens, and 17% will say it has no effect. Well, if you look at that distribution, it shows that 2 of the responses almost have the same amount of frequency as the other. So improve and worsen are basically close. But the no effect is also quite close in its valuation, not as close, but 45, 38 to 17, you can see how that distribution is not a bell curve. It's more of a hill, if you want to use that kind of definition. It gets up, it peaks, it goes down into the valley, and then comes back up. Now, the third of these is called a normal distribution. And a normal distribution is where it is a symmetrical bell curve, where things are essentially centered on a single mode for the most frequent response. Now, if you look at this, this is determining ideological self-placement. If 3% of people consider themselves extremely liberal, 13% consider themselves liberal, 11% consider themselves slightly liberal. If you look at conservatives, 5% consider themselves extremely conservative. 20% consider themselves to be conservative. 17% consider themselves to be slightly conservative. But the vast majority of the people who were polled in this, 31%, consider themselves to be moderates, in the middle, maybe moderate, and they consider themselves to be left of center or moderate right of center. But they're still basically within what we would consider to be a moderate. So remember the distributions, the skewed distribution, the bimodal, and the normal distribution. It is an important thing to think about when you're looking at the idea of polling and polling data. Now, another thing we look at when we look at polling data is whether it has a stable distribution or not. And what does a stable distribution mean? Well, a stable distribution is when the distribution of opinions shows little change over time. And this is when we look at something in long term. Like we look at a group of voters when they're in their teens, and then we look at them when they're in their 80s. And we do these polls. Usually they're polls based on how people feel about something like, say, gay marriage, or something like, let's say, abortion. And if you look at this particular poll that I'm going to use out of the textbook, it's percentage identifying as liberal. And when you look at this chart, what does it say? Well, you can look at it and kind of make some determinations. First of all, if you look at the chart, you will see that primarily younger voters, 17 to 24, and even 25 to 34, are consistently throughout the generations from 1972 to 2012, when this poll was taken, are more liberal. But if you look at it over the generations as well, other than maybe one little peak here and there, what you see is that as a person ages, number one, they either stay the same, but those that follow them, like their children, their grandchildren, and their great-grandchildren, become more liberal. And I'll give you an example of this. An example would be gay marriage. In 1980, people who were considered liberal would have said that they don't believe in discrimination. They don't believe that gays should not have the same rights as straight people, but that marriage was between a man and a woman, and so they were perfectly fine with something like, say, a civil union. Civil unions were fine, but they would make the argument that a civil union in 1980 would have to have the same rights, as in property rights, visitation rights, things like that for the partners. But that marriage should be between a man and a woman, at least that particular definition. Fast forward to 2012. Those people still probably have that same viewpoint. Some have changed, some haven't. The majority still have that same viewpoint. People who were teenagers in 1980, by 2012, probably feel the same way, that gays and straights should be able to have the same relationships, and that maybe marriage should be just between men and women. But those people who are now teenagers in 2012, even though, their children and grandchildren, or even though their parents and grandparents maybe consider themselves liberal, these people may be much more liberal than them, basically because they have a different viewpoint on gay marriage. And we see this in the polls a lot, is that people 30 and below in 2012 thought that this was a ridiculous argument. Why are we talking about gay marriage in 2012? Just let everybody get married, and if you don't like gay marriage, then don't get gay married. That was essentially what they were saying. And so it's not that the people have changed. It's that the people behind them have evolved and changed on an issue. And sometimes actually push their parents and grandparents to the left, or right, whichever way you want to go. I'm just using liberals as an example because this particular slide is liberal. The other thing that this says is that sometimes people become more conservative as times change around them. We do know that there is a phenomenon where people do start out in their teens more liberal than they end up at the end of their life. Not everybody, but the vast majority of people are more liberal in their teens and 20s and more conservative in their older age. Now, this is multiple phenomenons. This could be because as you age, you maybe change perspective on things, and maybe you're not as ideologically pure. Maybe you are more pragmatic. Maybe you're more negative in the way you look at certain things. The other thing is people, times change. Times change. If you look at something like, say, again, like gay marriage, people growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to them, gay marriage was something that was unachievable. Even if you were a gay person, the idea of even fighting for gay marriage was ridiculous, because why would you fight for something that's never going to happen? But in 2008, 2012, people are fighting for that same thing, but it becomes more likely because of the percentage of young people who were for it or just didn't care. And so these people who were, not necessarily for or against it, may now be pushed into the camp that they are against it, simply because the times have changed and they're not necessarily comfortable with time changing. Remember, that's something very important to realize too, is a lot of this has to do with people's general opinion and comfort. So keep that in mind when you're looking at polling data. Now, the question is, how do we get our political values? We're not born with them. Politics is an opinion. A wise person once told me, politics and religion is an opinion. Everyone has one and everyone's right. Well, you're not born with a religion. You're not born with politics. You are taught these things. You acquire them over your lifetime. And the question is, how do you acquire political values? Where do they come from? Well, here's some of the things we think about when we look at this. What is your earliest memory of a president? Who was the first president you remember? For many of you guys, I believe if I have my dates correct, are probably born in the early to mid portion of the presidency of George W. Bush, who was president from 2001 to 2009. So your earliest memory is probably either the very late portion of President Bush or the very early version of President Barack Obama, who was our previous president from 2009 until 2017. So many times people acquire the political values of the president who was in office when they came into being, when they came into their own as a person. And I say that because really, we only really exist as a person for values and ideas when we first are self-aware of ourselves. I was a person when I was a child, when I was a baby, but it wasn't until I basically started thinking for myself and doing for myself that I was really a person intellectually. And so when we look at this, we look at our earliest memories of a president, and that does have a bearing on who we are. For example, I was born in 1980. I was born the last few months of the Carter administration. But my first real memory, from what I remember, is watching the inauguration, the second inaugural of Ronald Reagan in 1985. When did you first learn about political parties? Well, this is difficult as well, because some people learn about them very early on because their parents are very politically active. So some people follow their parents. You hear, if you're growing up in a very conservative home and your parents are talking about Democrats this and Democrats that and Democrats, you may grow up to, dislike Democrats and get the political values of your parents because you first learned about a political party. Probably not unbiased. Let's face that. There was probably some bias there because your parents obviously had their own bias that they were pushing. When you first learn about these political parties, you begin to grow and create an opinion on them. Now, by the way, sometimes this doesn't work. Sometimes parents are sort of so overbearing that you hear about the political party so much that you eventually go the other way. And there is polling data to suggest that being super pro one political party is just as likely to make you a member of that party as it is to make you a member of the other party. Let's ask this about political values. If you identify with a political party, how did you decide to do it, and when? And that's something we talk about with political socialization. We try to find out when you started identifying with a party. How did you decide to identify with that party? What values or policies does that party prescribe to that makes you want to join them over the other? And let's say you're not a member of a party, and there are people out there. I'd say 30% of the American public says that they are independent, although that is debatable. If you do not, say, identify with a party, why don't you identify with that party? What is it about the two parties or three parties or however many parties you looked at that do not appeal to you? And that has a lot to do with how we socialize politically. Who was the first liberal that you met? Or who was the first conservative that you met? Do you even remember them? We grow up hearing liberals are evil or conservatives are evil in some homes, but who was the first liberal you met? And did they come off as being that evil? And who was the first conservative you met? And were they really that good or that evil? That's something we look at when we think about how we acquired our political values. Finally, do you and your parents have a similar political outlook? That really does go hand in hand with, what was your earliest memories and where did you learn about political parties and such? How did your parents influence your political outlook? For example, my father was a moderate Republican, what I would consider to be an Eisenhower Republican. My mother was very much a McGovern liberal. I turned out to be a very moderate on the scale of politicians, very moderate in ways. So I would argue that my father's slight conservatism and my mother's liberalism kind of pulled me to the middle. I mean, I remember Ronald Reagan, his inaugural, but I really remember more of the policies of George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. If you were to ask me who was the president that most influenced me, thinking back, I would have to say Bill Clinton, because Bill Clinton was in office when I was 13, 14, 15 years old. And that's really when we really start thinking about things like this. And so I would say that my parents and me, I think my mother's become more liberal with time, and I think my father, actually, believe it or not, has become a little more liberal with time, which is odd because mainly you go conservative with time. So when we look at political socialization, there's two theories that psychologists look at. First is the primacy principle. What is learned first is learned best. So what they say is what you learn young, well, that's pretty much where you're at. The other one is the structuring principle. What you learned first structures later learning. So in the primacy principle, you learn to be a Republican or a conservative, and you essentially stay a Republican conservative your entire life. Structuring says, no, you learn to be a Republican, but as you learn more things and develop, maybe it becomes more nuanced, and maybe you become a moderate or a liberal. Now, who teaches political behavior? Well, our family, our school, whether it be elementary, middle, high school, definitely university and college. College and university is great to learn different philosophies. And by the way, there's nothing wrong with learning from conservatives or learning from liberals because they do teach us different things, and you do learn different aspects of how people think. Community and peers. If you live in a community that's very, very conservative, but you've been a liberal and you moved into the community, that community may be able to teach you things that maybe you might not agree with them, but maybe it gives you second thoughts. Maybe it's something that, hey, maybe I can learn something and incorporate this into my own political values. But also continued socialization. This is a very important thing I tell all my students, whether it be history, government. The day you stop learning is really the day you die. People don't want to hear that. You hear a lot of people say, I know what I know and I don't want to know no more. Well, realistically, you have to continue learning. And the way you continue learning is through socialization. We talk to people on a daily basis, people with the same opinions, people with different opinions. And those things help inspire our own opinions, our own political values. So these are the four main ways that we learn political behavior. And by the way, all behavior. We learn all of our behavior this way, but we're focusing mainly on political behavior. Now, when we look at polls, what are we looking for? How do we split people up when we look at polls? Well, we use what we call demographics. And demographics are how we separate people. That's basically it. Do we separate people by hair color, by eye color? That's basically what a demographic is. But for politics, we have certain demographics we look at. We look at education. We look at income. We look at what region of the country you live in, what ethnicity you are, what religion you belong to, or what gender you belong to. And all these things are very important when we look at how people vote and why they vote. So, for example, education. We look at people and say, okay, how did they think about politics and what is the level of education that they finished? Do they have some high school? Did they graduate from high school? Did they attend college but not graduate? Did they earn an associate degree? Did they earn a bachelor's degree? Or did they go on to graduate school, professional school? Do they have a master's degree? Do they have a PhD? And by the way, when you look at education, there are correlations that the higher educated you are, you will go one way or another. Same thing with income. We look at what we consider to be the upper class, or the middle class, or the lower class. And depending on how much money you have, that does have some correlation to how you think about certain things in government. Regionally, if you look at the north and you look at the east and you look at the west, and I'm talking more northeast and maybe northwest, places like, if you want to go north and west, you could look at California, Oregon, Washington. They all basically have something in common. They're very liberal states. If you look at the northeast, the north and east portion of the United States, Maine down through Maryland, Pennsylvania, Delaware area, even starting to be Virginia, they are also very much alike. They are very, very liberal in their aspect. If you look at the southeast, which I would say is North Carolina, South Carolina, the old Confederacy, Alabama, Mississippi, Florida, although Florida is more of a swing state, but if you look at those, they have a lot in common. They're more conservative states, actually some of the most conservative in the country. If you look at the Midwest, very conservative with a liberal streak when it comes to certain things. And you look at places like the Southwest, Arizona, New Mexico, Texas. For a long time, the Southwest was fairly conservative, although Arizona has changed. Arizona is most likely a swing state in this election. New Mexico has become a definitely solid blue state over the last 10, 15 years, whereas Texas is still fairly conservative, fairly red, although that is changing as well. So regions are very important for how we look at polling, because it does tell us what different portions of the country are thinking at different times. Same thing with ethnicity and race. Here in the United States, this is the 2014 percentages. It's probably changed a little bit over the last 6 years. But 62% of Americans at that time were white. 17.4% were Latino. So they became the second highest minority group in the country. African Americans fell to 13% of the races here in the United States. 5.4% are Asian, and then 0.7% are Native Americans. Well, what does that tell us? Well, we basically can look at the ethnic breakdown and get an idea of how the different races vote. I'll give you an example. 13% of people in the United States of America in 2014 are African American. But of that 13% or so, in 2016, we know that about 91 or 92% of them voted for Secretary of State Hillary Clinton for President of the United States. So you could make the argument that of that 13%, the vast majority are Democratic or Democratic supporting voters. Latinos, you look at that, and then you can split it nearly in half. Mexican Americans, about 75% on a normal election might vote Democratic, 25% might vote Republican. But if you're Cuban Latino, that will be the flip. 65 to 80% will vote Republican, whereas the rest will vote Democratic. Whites, it's going to be determinant of other things, education, income, and what region they're in. So these all kind of flow together. So it's not like one thing is looked at overall. But we do separate them to look at certain trends. Religion's another one. 49% of people in the United States in 2014 considered themselves Protestants or non-Catholic Christians. 21% considered themselves to be Catholic. 2% considered themselves to be Jewish. And 1% considered themselves to be Muslim. Now, one number that's missing here is those who are either atheist or don't follow a particular church. Maybe they're spiritual. That is now the second highest number in the country. 24 to 25% of Americans consider themselves to be non-religious in some way. So that's also something we have to look at. How do the religious breakdowns determine things? If you're a Protestant non-Catholic Christian, you're more likely to be a Republican. If you're Catholic or Jewish, you're more likely to be a Democrat. Gender is very important as well. Men and women, they're about 50-50 of the population. I mean, that's kind of obvious, the way we're born. 50% of people are men, 50% are women. Obviously, there's a few points here and there because, one year you may have more men born, one year you may have more women born. But for the purposes of this, 50-50. When we look at certain things about women, you'll see that women are maybe more likely to support certain things that men maybe don't. So all these things kind of flow together. We look at these things when we're looking at polls, but they don't tell us the whole thing. They just tell us a snapshot of that. Now, in order to explore how polls are done and how they're read, I want to use this poll out of the textbook to kind of explain some things. Now, this is a poll that was done. I think it was done in 2012. And what they're asked two different questions. Should government outlaw abortions? And should the government guarantee jobs? Essentially what they're asking about is, where do you stand on freedom versus order? Okay, where do you stand on freedom versus order when it deals with abortions? And where do you stand on equality regarding the government guaranteeing some kind of employment? And when you look at it, look at how divided it is. And that's kind of why this is the graph we're using, is because it is very divided. And what it does is it breaks things down, look, into what I was talking about, into the different demographics, levels of education, household income, region, ethnic group, religious affiliation, and gender. So this is a great, and by the way, the line coming down, that's the average. So in this, 39% of the public said yes, the government should outlaw abortion. And 28% of the public said yes, the government should guarantee jobs. So both of them, by the way, are in the minority. Okay, the minority says that abortion should be outlawed, and the minority says that government should guarantee jobs. Well, when we look at this and we break it down to education, let's take a look at it for a minute. Well, They separated this into no high school, some college, and college degree. So they're not going to go into whether you got a bachelor's or associate's or a master's or a PhD. They're just saying whether you have a degree or not. Well, if you look at how this is read, let's look at abortion rights first. Okay. When we look at the idea of education, okay. First, let's take a look at education itself, because education, what it does a lot of times, is it increases our awareness and understanding of a political issue. The more educated you are, the more information you have. Okay, if you have no high school, well, you probably are, you're able to learn, but you haven't actually done the learning. You haven't studied all the intense things. You guys are all in high school right now. So you understand you're just getting a taste for a lot of this. You're just starting you may be juniors or seniors in high school, but really you're still in the infancy of your intellectual development. You've got the rest of high school, you've got college, and then whatever else you plan to do. And so when you look at education, it's very important because it does increase our awareness and understanding of things, and in this case, political issues. But also something about education is it also promotes tolerance. If you look at, say, gay marriage, more people are likely to support gay marriage with some college or college degrees than people with no high school or high school. Because they've probably met more gay people over the years, or maybe they've met more African Americans through college or university, and so they may be more likely to say want some kind of police reform, versus someone who has no high school or high school who's lived in the same community their entire life and is now being told, well, okay, I guess we need to talk about, say, police reform. They don't maybe know, but maybe a few black people in their entire life. So when you let's look at abortion rights first. Let's make some assumptions based on what this says. First of all, people with less education, people with no high school or a high school diploma, are more likely to say that the government should outlaw abortion. People with some college or a college degree are more likely to say that the government should just leave it alone. But when you look at guaranteeing jobs, if you look at how it's set up, people with less education actually do favor government action to guarantee jobs and a good standard of living. 43% of people with no high school say that they would like to see the government guarantee jobs. 34% of people with a high school diploma say the same thing. Those people with more education, who have more opportunities, they oppose that kind of government action because they would prefer freedom over equality. 25% of people with some college believe that the government should guarantee jobs versus 20% of people with a college degree. Their argument is, well, we went to college, we got degrees, we worked hard, therefore the government shouldn't guarantee a job. You should go out and earn it. So what that tells us is, as I said, people with less education favor the government action on this particular issue versus those with education, they oppose it. So why is that? Well, the better educated people are, you would expect them to be humanitarians and to support government programs to help the needy. But educated people tend to be wealthier. So they tend to be taxed more heavily for these government programs. So when you're asking them, should the government guarantee a job, what you're asking them is, are you willing to pay to help someone get a guaranteed job? And those people may not be up to that. They may not want to pay more taxes to do that. But the other thing is, they may also be more realistic than, say, the people with no high school or high school, because they've gone through more education. So when they look at the way the world works, they say, wait a minute, Is it really realistic to expect our government to make a guarantee that everyone in the country has a job? So there's two things going on there. One, they may be fearing that they're going to have to pay more in taxes to ensure you a government, some kind of job, or they may also be saying, well, wait a minute, maybe it's just not feasible. So that's what we would infer from this particular poll here by looking just at the education demographic. Now let's look at income. And for this particular chart, the income is set up as someone who makes $30,000 or under, $30,000 to $59,000 a year, $60,000 to $99,999 a year, or those people who make $100,000 or more. Now, what does this poll tell us about abortion and about guaranteed jobs? Well, first of all, remember that in many countries, differences in social class is based on social background and occupation, and therefore it divides people in their politics. Those with money stick together, those without money stick together, and there is a tension. There always has been a tension since basically the time when people started collecting things and becoming wealthy. When we look at how this particular chart works, how this poll works, the example we're using is, again, abortion and government guaranteed jobs. What we can infer by this is those with incomes under $60,000 a year, they favor outlawing abortions. So those people, say in the under 30%, 46% favor outlawing abortion, and 30 to 60%, 59,999, they 44% support outlawing abortion. But then those people earning over $60,000 a year, 60,000 to 99,999, and then 100,000 or more, they oppose it, 33% and 27%. Now, what does this tell us? Well, it tells us the more money you make, the more likely you are going to support outlawing abortion. But that's not really what it tells us, because there's other demographics. Obviously, working with that is college education. And, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to oppose outlawing abortion. So they work together. But what's it tell us about government guaranteed jobs? Well, by looking at it, 44% of people under 30,000 say that the government should guarantee jobs. 25% of people over 30,000 but below 60,000 believe that the government should do that. Those making $60,000 to $99,999, 18% believe that, and then over $100,000, 12% believe it. So what does that say? Well, wealth is linked to opinions favoring limited government role in promoting both equality and order. The people who make the least amount of money favor government guarantees of employment and living conditions. Those people with incomes under 60,000 also favor outlawing abortions more than those that do it for 60,000. So you look at that and they kind of correlate. If you are low income, you probably would support government guaranteeing jobs, and you would also support abolishing abortion. Now, if you look at both issues, as I said, similar effect. The people with more education and higher income favor more freedom. The people that don't have that income, they would like to see more restrictions. So it just kind of goes hand in hand. And again, you can't separate one without the other. You still have to keep looking back at the other demographics. Now let's look at region for a minute. And the question again is, should government outlaw abortions and should government guarantee jobs? And the parts of the country that we're going to look at is the South, the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West. When we look at this, what do we see? Well, it looks like the South and the Midwest both agree, 45% to 45%, that the government should outlaw abortion. But in the Northeast and the West, 32%, and 30% say the government should outlaw abortion. So the obvious inference from this is that people in the South and the Midwest are more likely to favor restricting abortion than people in the Northeast or the West. But then when we look at should government guarantee jobs, if you look at the South is 28% say they should. The Midwest, 25% say they should. The Northeast, 28% say they should. And the West, 30% say they should. So the way I would argue this is that there really is no regional influence on this. They're all basically the same. It's minimal. The regional differences are minimal when it comes to government efforts on standard of living and government guaranteed jobs. If you look at it, it's basically within, see where it says 28% of the public says yes, 28, 25, 28, 30, they're all basically within the margin of error. So they are the average. They are the national average. So that is where that comes in. Now, ethnicity and race. And the ethnicities we're going to look at are white, black, and Latino. A lot of times white is defined as not Latino and black is defined as not Latino because there are white people and there are black people who have Latino blood in them. They therefore would be considered Latino in this particular way we do demographics. So let's look at this for a minute. If you look at whites, 40% of whites believe that the government should outlaw abortion. 39% of blacks say the same thing. Latinos, 43% of Latinos say that we should outlaw abortion, with 33% considered others. Now that could be Asians, that could be people of multiple mixed races, Native Americans. That's what other essentially means. Anybody who doesn't fit in the other three categories. So when you look at it, the abortion issue has less difference when it comes to ethnicity and race, although from what I just said, the Latinos do slightly favor government restrictions on abortion more than the other groups, and it's only slightly, 43 to 40, 39 and 33. But if you look at government guaranteed jobs, look at that a minute. Whites, 25% of whites would like government guaranteed jobs, but 56% of blacks would like to see government guaranteed jobs. 44% of Latinos feel the same way, and then 34% of others. Well, what this tells us by looking at it is that the minority groups, most particularly African Americans, are more likely than whites to favor government action to improve economic opportunity. Well, why would that be? Well, one argument would be that whites have more economic opportunity to begin with. So that would be basically what that is telling us as a snapshot, is that depending on your race, you are more likely, if you are a minority, you're more likely to support government guaranteed jobs, but there is really no guarantee, depending on your ethnicity, how you're going to feel about outlawing of abortion. Okay, now let's look at the role of religion in polling. Now we're going to look at the same two questions. Should government outlaw abortion? And should government guarantee jobs? Now if you look at it, we're going to look at Catholics, other Christians, other religions, and not religious. And we're going to look at those for both category when we look at religious affiliation. When you look at abortion, 41% of Catholics say the government should outlaw abortion. 48% of other Christians say the same thing. When you look at other religions, 14% of them say that abortion should be outlawed. And of the non-religious people, 23% say the government should outlaw abortion. So what does this say? Well, it says a couple things. First of all, the more religious you are, the more likely you are to oppose abortion. But one thing that's interesting is Protestants, other Christians, favor government action to limit abortion even more than Catholics. And Catholics have been traditionally more supportive of government outlawing abortion, but now it looks like Protestants have jumped above them with 48%. Non-Christians and people who are not religious overwhelmingly favor a woman's right to choose. So we can make those assumptions based on the religious level of a person. Now let's look at government guaranteed jobs. 22% of Catholics believe the government should guarantee a job. 27% of other Christians believe that the government should guarantee jobs. Now, whatever these other religions are, 62% state that the government should guarantee a job. And then 30% of those people who say they're not religious say the government should guarantee a job. So what does it say? What does that mean to us? Well, first, it means that evangelical Protestants are more likely to oppose social programs. So, we could say the government guaranteed jobs, but let's just throw anything in there. Gay marriage, death penalty. So, for the purpose of this, gay marriage, evangelical Protestants are more likely to oppose that, more likely to oppose government guaranteeing jobs, also probably support the death penalty, while also favoring the right to life over abortion. But then if you look at things like evangelicals and Jews, they're more likely to express support for Israel and the Middle East politics. So we know those things because they're standard. But when we look at government jobs, you say the same thing. You look at this and you look at evangelical Protestants and Catholics and you say, well, again, it's a different type of social program or policy, but it's obvious that Catholics and other Christians are more likely to oppose the guarantee of government jobs versus other religions and non-religious people. So religion can tell us a lot about how someone views policy. And that's why we do study religious breakdowns in polls. Now let's look at gender. And as I said, gender is essentially 50-50 when it comes to the population. Now, if you look at females and you're talking about abortion, 42% of females believe that the government should outlaw abortion. 36% of men believe that the government should outlaw abortion. Now, that being said, we know that primarily by looking at this poll, you would think that women are more likely to support the abolition of abortion. But if you look at a series of polls, it's usually more likely that women are more supportive of pro-choice than men. This particular poll, you would say, is maybe an outlier. We know this because you look at the polls throughout the years, and women have strongly been more supportive of being pro-choice than men. It's ironic. Men don't really have anything to do with it, and they're usually more pro-life than women. But look at it from the other standpoint of women are also consistently less supportive of the death penalty. Women are less supportive of going to war. Women are the ones that carry the child, so a lot of times they're more supportive of pro-choice, but they're also the ones that raise that child, and so a lot of times they're less supportive of the death penalty and of going to war if it means their child is the one that's going to be killed. Now let's look at should the government guarantee jobs? Well, 29% of women say yes, 27% of males say no. Now, this is a very close one. This is actually within the margin of error. 27 males, 29 females. The median is 28%, so it's right there. But women are consistently more supportive than men of government programs. They're also usually more supportive of things like gay marriage, environmental policy, government spending for social programs like Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. So when we look at gender, we can tell a lot about voters and how they how they think when it comes to policy. We're just using abortion and jobs as the examples for the slide, but you can infer a lot with gender as well. Now let's look at ideology for a minute and ideological thinking in public policy. Well, first of all, a lot of people run around calling themselves conservatives or liberals when they discuss politics with people. But few people actually consider themselves to be conservative or liberal when you compare it to the actual ideological definition. As a matter of fact, most people don't even know the actual real definition of a conservative or liberal. They just say it. I'm a conservative or I'm a liberal. And you see this because what happens is you have this political socialization. You meet people. You want to be in groups. And so what a lot of times happens is it leads people to start thinking ideologically, thinking like other people, to a point where you end up thinking things and you don't actually even understand why you think it. Now, there are true ideologues out there, people who are consistent with their set of values and beliefs. These people, know the purpose, know their version of the purpose and scope of government. They evaluate candidates in ideological terms. But most Americans don't actually do that. Most Americans simply look at, an R and a D, and they know who they're going to vote for simply because they're in that club. Ideological thinkers are usually people who, they may be Republicans. Let's use Republicans as an example. You have a lot of ideological Republicans right now who are refusing to support President Donald J. Trump for his reelection here in the fall because they are true ideologues. They believe in certain things, and there are things that Donald Trump does that is completely against their ideology. They don't like some of the things he does, or they don't like anything that he does. They don't like how he behaves. And so they're saying, ideology is more important to me than having a president that is a Republican for 4 more years. That happens because there are people out there. There are true ideologues, but most of us aren't. Most of us are not true ideologues. And the reality of it is the extent of ideological thinking in America can be displayed by what people know when you ask them questions. I can ask you if you're a liberal or a conservative, and you might tell me you're a liberal or a conservative. But then I might ask you why. Why are you a liberal or why are you a conservative? Well, you might start telling me things. And as a political researcher, I can then start asking you follow-ups. And a lot of times you'll find a lot of not hypocrisy, because that's the wrong word, but you'll find a lot of places where people's beliefs will actually clash. So for example, let's use abortion again, just because it popped in my head. Okay, so say you're pro-life. You do not believe that abortion should be done in any particular way. Well, then you start asking the questions. Okay, well, what if it's your 12-year-old daughter who's been raped by a 27-year-old man? Well, no, I don't think I would let her have an abortion for that. That's just against my beliefs. Okay. All right. Okay, fair. Okay, so you say you don't believe in abortion. So what if it is say your wife's pregnant and she's dying and the baby's already dead? Do you do the medical procedure to save your wife's life? Well, yeah, of course. Okay, well, that is a crude example of how there is some push between true ideological thinking and what we call pragmatic thinking. Because a pragmatist would say, okay, I don't like abortion. I wouldn't have an abortion if I was a woman. But if my wife is dying and it's between my wife and an unborn child that is not viable, I have to choose my wife. That would be a pragmatic reasoning. Because why? Well, you could always have another child, but you may not be able to have another child with that wife if she ends up dying. So pragmatism is basically what most of us do. Most of us are not true ideological thinkers because we don't have the time or effort to do that. We've got all kinds of other things going on in our life, and we see the world in gray. Most people do see the world in gray. Ideological thinkers think of the world in black and white. It's either right or wrong. Whereas most people who are pragmatists will admit that there are shades of right and there are shades of wrong, and you have to make the best decision you possibly can. So when I'm doing political research, when I'm talking to voters, I can usually get a real good tell whether or not they are ideological or pragmatists. Now, the other thing about it is the majority of Americans actually do identify themselves as liberal or conservative, even if they don't even know what those things mean. So, you can ask, I'd say right now, currently, my best guess would say 30 to 40% of Americans are liberal, 30 to 40% are conservative, and the rest are somewhere in the middle. They're moderates. So 30, that's 60, and then 40% of the American people are basically moderate swing voters. So that's how we look at ideological thinking and public opinion. Okay, so let's look at ideological philosophy when it comes to the poll. Now, the poll we're looking at, this is the same poll that you looked at in the slides before. The only difference is they've asked it a different way, and they've shifted the way the poll is. Instead of it being a bar chart going from left to right, it's now going from bottom to top. Now, what does this poll say? Well, okay, so how we're going to read it is this. If you ask liberals their position on outlawing abortion and guaranteeing jobs, and you ask it in the negative, don't outlaw, don't guarantee, 83% of liberals support not outlawing abortion. 83% do not want to outlaw abortion. And 26% do not want to guarantee jobs. 37% of moderates do not want to outlaw abortion. 44% do not want to guarantee jobs. And then the conservatives, 51% of conservatives do not want to outlaw abortion. 76% of conservatives do not want to guarantee jobs. So what does this tell us? Well, it tells us that liberals favor freedom on abortion and equality on jobs, because that's basically where their standpoint is. It says that conservatives are favoring order on abortion over freedom of jobs, but freedom of jobs, may be somewhat important to them. But let's look at it from multiple standpoints, and let's go down to here, this bottom graph, where it brings in libertarians and communitarians. If you look at libertarians, they seem to be okay with both. They favored the freedom to, have an abortion and the freedom to be able to get a job and not have the government involved in your job. Communitarians, on the reverse, favored order on abortion. Communitarians would prefer to see abortion illegal and also do not want equality for jobs. So sometimes these are a little hard to understand when they lump them all together. And yes, blump is a technical term. When they lump them all together and bring them all in, it sometimes is a little difficult to read, but you just kind of have to look at the colors and kind of get your eyes around it. But ideological is very important when it comes to that, because sometimes if you are a true ideologue, you will tell the truth on these polls, and you do get a good basis as to where people lay. Now, the problem with politics and policy is public knowledge. Here in the United States, we're lucky. Education is compulsory. Usually in most states, it's to the age of 16. You have to go to school until 16. After 16, you can choose to drop out. So because of this, the United States has a relatively high literacy rate. You can talk about other things like critical thinking and deep reading, and that's a totally different area. But our literacy rate is relatively high. We also have an unparalleled network of colleges and universities. We have community colleges. We have local regional colleges. We have large universities. So if you look at that, Americans can get educated very easily today. American citizens also can obtain information from a variety of news sources. You can watch the news. You can get online and go to a website. You can actually open up this antiquated thing I'm sure none of you have ever seen before called a newspaper. I'm sure you've seen the electronic newspapers. I'm kidding, of course. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen the paper, but not for long. Most of them are gone out of business. But there has never been an easier time for American citizens to obtain information as there has been right now. We literally have information at the tips of our fingers with the internet. And most Americans, by the way, do consider themselves to be at least up on national and internal affairs. Now, the way they do this is mainly through live coverage on network and cable news. But for the first time really in world history, we have up-to-the-minute live coverage worldwide, being able to find out everything we know within a matter of minutes. Now, all this being said, how much do Americans really know about politics? Well, not as much as they should. The American public, for the most part, is not politically knowledgeable. And when looking at a pure majoritarian model of democracy, the Founding Fathers were right. The majority of people in the United States don't really understand politics. They don't understand policy. And therefore, maybe that is some justification for the way they set our government up. First thing is, information about the structure of our government and about current affairs is far from ideal. I can show you polls and studies that show that Americans have a very elementary level of information about their government. And we see these all the time. Jay Leno, when he used to host The Tonight Show with Jay Leno, used to do something called jaywalking, where he, ask people a series of random questions. Who's the vice president? Who's the chief justice of the U.S. Supreme Court? How many branches of government are there? And the whole joke was how many people got it wrong, and you laughed at them and you said, look at that fool, doesn't know who the vice president is or doesn't know who the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff are. Well, while that might seem funny, and you might shake your head and say, why do I really need to know who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is? Well, the problem is if you're going to be a knowledgeable voter and you're going to be a part of the government process, you have to have some kind of basic information. If you don't know who's a member of the executive branch or who's a member of the legislative branch or the checks and balances or some of that stuff, then really that is a red flag about how little you know about the American government. Or how about current events or current affairs? Do you know what policies are being discussed in the election, the 2020 election, and where each candidate stands on these? And can you actually find the truth? That's the other thing, is a lot of times. So, for example, people can be very resistant to new information that might challenge their existing beliefs. I'll give you an example of this election, 2020 election. President Trump is telling his supporters that if Joe Biden wins the presidency, he will support defunding the police. Well, if you only listen to Donald Trump, you would believe it. Well, Joe Biden's going to defund the police. If you were to go and actually dig deeper, you will see that Joe Biden is actually one of the most pro-police candidates in the United States. In the 90s, he helped pass the law that helped put more police on the street. And Joe Biden has said repeatedly throughout this campaign that he is not going to defund the police if elected president. Problem is people can be very resistant to new information. They know what they know and they don't want to know anymore. And when you tell them, yeah, I understand where you're coming from, but you're wrong, no one wants to be challenged on their existing beliefs. No one wants to actually learn anything. And so this is where current affairs come in, is how much about current affairs do you know? And information that we have taken over the last 20 years shows that the American public is not very well informed on current affairs. So I'm not saying the American public is stupid. Please don't, that's not what I'm saying. It's more that the American public just doesn't care. They're apathetic to knowing the three branches of government. They could care less about what happened in Iran last night that might affect the United States. They're busy, they're living their lives, they're doing their thing, and they have their own set of beliefs, and they don't want to know anything in most cases more than they already know. But I will say this, when people are given more time to think about it, and you really push them on the issues, when the news media actually focuses on issues that are important, issues that are coming up, levels of public opinion among the American public does actually rise. For example, I'll say that the Black Lives Matters movement, most of the polling, national polling, shows that while people may not support the violent protesting and looting and things of that nature, the vast majority of Americans are for police reform, especially when it comes to minorities. Even white Americans, when polled, say that they've essentially had enough, that they would like to see some kind of police reform when it comes to minorities. Now, that just didn't happen in a vacuum. People were given more time to think about it. The news media was focused on Black Lives Matter. Yes, they sensationalize things. We all agree on that because of ratings. That's what they do. But when people see, a guy walking away from the police, not doing something, and then getting shot, whether he's obeying them or not, that's not the issue. The issue the American people start asking themselves is, wait a minute, he's not obeying the police, but he's not like attacking them either. Did he really deserve to die in that? And so people, when given more time to think about it, they do tend to change their opinion. And we see this in polls all the time. 5 years ago, the Black Lives Matter movement, when it came to police reform, and we're talking about police reform, most Americans didn't really care about police reform. Now it's a major issue in a presidential campaign, and we'll see where that goes. And the lucky thing about this is we get to talk about the election this term. My last class last year, we talked about an election that already went past. We're going to get to talk about the election as it's happening. So that's always interesting to do. So that's kind of where we are with political knowledge. We're not as knowledgeable as we should be. Now, obviously, I teach political science. I have a master's in political science. I obviously know more about political science than most people do. But the average American, they just don't really care. And so you probably will leave this class knowing more than the average American does here in 2020. Now, how do people think about policy? Well, when we look at political science, we look at what we call the self-interest principle. And what the self-interest principle says is that people usually choose what benefits them personally. Now, this makes sense. Self-interest affects how people form opinions on policies with clear costs and benefits. We look at things of how they affect us. There's the old saying that James Carville said during the 1992 election when he was running the Clinton campaign. He said, "It's the economy, stupid." Well, it turned out that the election did have to do with the economy. Bill Clinton ran on the economy, and Bill Clinton beat George H.W. Bush in the election. When you look at self-interest, people who pay taxes, and I mean people who pay a lot of taxes, tend to prefer low taxes to high taxes. It is what it is. People who smoke tend to oppose smoking bans in public places. Gun owners are less likely to support handgun control. People who are well off financially tend to be less supportive of what we call redistribution of wealth through social welfare policies. People who are less well off are probably more likely to support redistribution of wealth through some kind of social welfare policy. So when we look at how people look at politics, there is a very, very important aspect of this, of how it affects us daily. As they say, these are pocketbook or wallet issues, and they do tend to really affect a person's viewpoint on, say, um, not let's say tax policy or government spending. Now, not uncommon, but more rare than the self-interest is what we call sociotropic responses. Now, these are opinions about how the country as a whole is doing. And people who are more interested in how the country is doing as a whole than their own personal circumstances. So, in this case, opinions are driven more by how the country is doing rather than how you're doing personally. Now, that seems a little bit pragmatic, and it is, but there is some self-interest in this as well, because a lot of people do say that if you are sociotropic, you do believe in that the reason they seem to have those opinions is the stronger the national condition is, the more likely their own lives will be affected. But, for example, this would be, I'll give you an example of this. I am in the higher tax bracket. And so if you were to do a poll on me, I would probably be a little more outside the realm of other people. I'd probably be okay with my taxes going up a little bit to fund something. Now, obviously, it would have to be something that not only helps the average American, but also people that are in my tax bracket. So, for example, maybe, I don't know, maybe if they were going to raise taxes a little bit on the upper class to help pay for a national railroad system like they have in Europe. If you've ever been to Europe, you'll know that they have some of the best railroads in the world, high-speed rail. I don't know, I might be okay with that because I would probably use it. And so my opinion on that wouldn't necessarily be what would be best in my own personal circumstances, low taxes, but what's better for the country, because if the country got it, then I would expect to be able to use it in my own personal life. So sociotropic responses are common, but not as common as self-interest responses. Now, the last part of public opinion is political leadership. Now, you might say, well, how's political leadership do anything with public opinion? Well, actually, our public opinion is actually molded by political leaders, journalists, and policy experts. You see them on TV all the time. They're there to try to convince you to take their side. As I said, they're cue givers to the members of the public. They're there to get you to rally around them. And a lot of times, it may not even be because you like the policy. A lot of times, it's people who are favorable towards the politician. They say, wait a minute, I'm more likely to support their values because I like that politician. An example of this is John McCain. There are a lot of Republicans that had a lot of things that they didn't agree with John McCain on, but they were ready to go vote for him in 2008 because they liked him. He wasn't the most conservative candidate in the 2008 Republican primary. He was probably in the middle of the pack, if not more towards the left. But people genuinely liked him, and they supported his values. His policy agenda, well, they could get behind it, but they had a favorable view on him, and so they let him talk and convince them to come to him. And this is what politicians do all the time. They routinely make appeals to the public. Both candidates are doing this right now. President Trump and former Vice President Biden are making appeals to the public, asking for people who share their political ideology and self-interest to vote for them. And they're making plans and policies of which they want to enact when they become, if they're reelected or if they become president. And one thing about this is you do see competition and controversy among political elites. You see this, let me use the Republican Party as an example. You have people who want to do things that maybe are not administrative friendly. Mitt Romney, the 2012 Republican nominee, is currently a senator from the state of Utah. And he has famously not always agreed 100% with the Trump administration. No one could say he was not a member of the political elite. He was a former Republican nominee. He also has a very large following. Supporters who, by the way, are not fans of the incumbent president. And so this creates a competition between the Trump loyalists within the Republican Party and those people who don't like Trump, who are willing to go along with Romney or whoever. You could think of Jeff Flake, the former Arizona senator who recently retired, as another example of a leader of a competing wing of the Republican Party. And these politicians are, by the way, well aware that the citizens don't always understand, but will support them depending on how they frame it. And this is what we call issue framing. This is how politicians or interest groups, the leadership, define an issue when presenting it to the public. And there's always a spin to try to make it as favorable as possible. Now, by the way, the ability of the political leaders to influence policy and public opinion has been enhanced over the last 30 years by broadcast media, especially television, and the internet. They now have unlimited time to be on TV and on Facebook and all these other things to spread their agenda. And to go back to that whole majoritarian versus plurality, if you look at the majoritarian model of democracy, it assumes that government officials will respond to public opinion, and evidence exists that, yes, responsiveness does occur, but in many times, it's the political leaders who try to sway the opinion towards them. They try to educate or sway the public to convince them to agree with them instead of them conforming to what the public wants. So that is how polling and public opinion, that is how it is determined when looking at the influence in government.